I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen bee.
The confrontation did not begin with raised voices. It began with a sealed document placed between a husband and wife. Camilla had just learned that an old decree bearing Queen Elizabeth's authority could prevent her from using several royal residences without formal approval. Within minutes, she went directly to Charles and demanded that he reverse it. But when the king saw the wording for himself, his silence became more frightening than any answer. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla had barely finished reading when the shock turned personal. A senior household official had placed the file before her and explained, with painful calm, that becoming Charles's wife had never automatically erased the restriction. The decree, a formal written order carrying the monarch's authority, covered independent access to selected crown-controlled residences, meaning royal properties managed for the sovereign, rather than simply owned as ordinary private homes. Balmoral, Sandringham, and Windsor, linked accommodation all appeared within the wider arrangement. For her, that distinction felt devastating. She had become queen consort, yet Elizabeth's written boundary still appeared capable of treating her presence inside parts of royal life as something granted rather than guaranteed. Camilla carried that anger straight to Charles. She entered his private room holding the file against her chest, crossed to the table, and placed it directly before him. There was no attempt to soften the demand. She wanted the decree reversed immediately. The king opened the first page, read it once, then started again. His expression changed slowly. When he reached the final lines, he removed his glasses and placed them beside the document without speaking. She watched him closely, expecting irritation, perhaps disbelief. Instead, she saw recognition. Charles understood why the wording mattered. The restriction did not simply describe Elizabeth's preference while she was alive. One clause stated that it survived a change of reign unless revoked through a separate royal instrument, a new formal act issued under sovereign authority. That meant accession alone had not destroyed it. Elizabeth had apparently ensured that whoever came after her would have to make a conscious decision to remove the safeguard. Reversal would therefore carry Charles's name, his authority, and his responsibility. Camilla leaned forward, certain the answer should still be simple. If he possessed the power, then he could sign. Yet the monarch kept staring at one handwritten notation attached to the file. Something there unsettled him even more than the restriction itself. She demanded to know what he was thinking. Charles finally looked up, but he did not promise to revoke anything. His first words were quieter and far more dangerous. Who else has seen this? That question changes everything, because the argument is no longer just about buildings. It is suddenly about who knew Elizabeth's final boundary existed, and why Camilla was never told. For Camilla, this is not about keys, bedrooms, or addresses. It is about what those closed doors symbolize. She has spent years moving from tolerated outsider to crowned queen, standing beside Charles through scandal, grief, and public judgment. Yet one document now threatens to tell her that even after all of that, Elizabeth drew a line she was never meant to cross. And Charles is trapped directly between the woman he married and the mother whose authority still echoes around him. Camilla remained across from him, but the anger that had carried her into the room was beginning to change. Now there was hurt beneath it. She had accepted years of scrutiny because she believed every difficult step had eventually brought her closer to full acceptance. Becoming queen consort, the title given to the wife of a reigning king, had seemed to settle that question at last. Yet the decree in front of them suggested something different. Public rank had changed. Ceremonies had changed. Her place beside Charles had changed. But somewhere inside the machinery of the crown, Elizabeth had preserved a boundary that survived all of it. Camilla looked directly at her husband and asked the question he had been trying not to hear. Did he truly believe she should still need permission to occupy places connected to the life they shared? Charles shifted slightly, but did not answer at once. He understood that she was not really asking about Balmoral or Windsor. She was asking whether his mother had ever trusted her enough to belong without conditions. More painfully, she was asking whether he agreed with that judgment now. Charles reached again for the handwritten notation attached to the decree. His finger moved beneath one sentence, slowly enough for Camilla to notice the hesitation. The king read it twice. Then, before she could lean forward, he closed the folder. That small movement sharpened the tension immediately. She demanded to know what the note said. He answered only that Elizabeth had been very specific when she approved the restriction. The monarch's reluctance told her more than the words themselves. Camilla's expression hardened. She knew Charles well enough to recognize when memory had taken hold of him. Something in that notation had pulled him away from the present argument and back toward a moment he clearly remembered. She pressed him again. Was this restriction really about her position, or had something happened years earlier that caused Elizabeth to make it personal? Charles did not deny it. That silence struck harder than any accusation. Camilla realized the decree had not grown from vague mistrust or old palace discomfort. There had been a trigger, a conversation, a moment serious enough for Elizabeth to turn private concern into written authority. And buried behind that silence is one private confrontation at Windsor. The moment Elizabeth apparently decided that affection, marriage, and institutional trust were three very different things. The decree did not appear from nowhere. Years earlier, one tense evening at Windsor created the rupture that would quietly survive Elizabeth herself. A disagreement over the future use of a private royal apartment turned into something deeper when Camilla challenged a household restriction she believed no longer reflected her position. Elizabeth listened, said very little, and ended the conversation with a sentence that Charles would never forget. From that night forward, the question of residence became a question of trust. Camilla had entered that earlier meeting, believing she was asking for something practical. She wanted a suite reserved for direct sovereign use, to become part of her own future household, giving her greater freedom over where she could stay, host, and keep personal arrangements beside Charles. Windsor mattered, because its rooms were not all treated the same. Some belonged to the working crown, some were connected directly to the sovereign, and others could be used only through formal assignment or invitation. To her, those distinctions had begun to feel increasingly artificial after years spent at the prince's side. Elizabeth heard the request without interruption. The queen understood that Camilla no longer saw herself as temporary, and that was exactly why the request carried weight. When the monarch refused, the answer was calm but final. Camilla pushed back. She said constantly needing approval made her feel like a guest inside a family she had already sacrificed so much to join. Elizabeth remained seated, folded her hands, and answered with the sentence that would later return with extraordinary force. Belonging to the family does not mean owning the institution. Charles learned how serious the exchange had become almost immediately. He approached his mother privately and tried to soften what had happened, arguing that Camilla's request had come from insecurity rather than ambition. Elizabeth did not attack her. Instead, she warned her son that future kings would sometimes have to separate personal loyalty from crown responsibility. The distinction mattered because a private concession made for love could become an institutional expectation for every consort who came after. Weeks later, the disagreement stopped being merely personal. Private secretarial instructions began moving through the royal household, and a legal draft was prepared limiting automatic residence rights for anyone whose authority came through marriage rather than direct sovereign power. The wording was careful. It did not name old resentments. It turned one painful confrontation into a lasting rule. Charles now understood exactly what lay inside the folder before him. This was the finished version of the response that had begun that night at Windsor. Camilla understood something equally painful. He had known enough about the original dispute to recognize Elizabeth's reasoning the moment he saw the notation. The past has now entered the room with them, and Camilla is no longer asking Charles to change a technical order. She is asking him to publicly choose whose judgment matters more. Camilla does not retreat. Once she understands that Elizabeth's restriction was intentional, her anger sharpens rather than fades. She wants the document revoked, not reviewed. Charles wants time. For several minutes, the conversation circles around legal language, precedent, and household procedure, until Camilla finally cuts through all of it. She asks whether he is her husband first, or the guardian of his mother's decisions first. This time, Charles cannot answer with silence. Charles keeps his voice controlled, but the tension is no longer hidden. He explains that the decree cannot simply disappear because he says so. Elizabeth had structured it as a continuing sovereign instruction, meaning a written order designed to survive beyond one reign, unless another monarch formally cancels it. That detail matters because his accession changed who wore the crown, but it did not automatically erase every rule created before him. Camilla hears the explanation and immediately rejects what it seems to imply. In her mind, a new reign should mean a new judgment. Camilla pushes the document back across the table. No aides stand between them now. No secretary can soften the language. She looks directly at him and says, "Then sign the reversal." A pen rests only inches from his hand, yet Charles does not reach for it. That hesitation wounds her more deeply than any technical argument. She accuses him of allowing Elizabeth's distrust to follow her beyond the grave, as though years of loyalty, service, and public endurance still cannot outweigh one old judgment. Charles finally pushes back. He tells her that not every inherited limit can be treated as a personal attack. If he overturns a crown safeguard simply because it hurts someone he loves, then marriage begins controlling monarchy instead of existing beside it. Camilla stiffens at the words. To her, that sounds less like caution and more like confirmation that the institution will always place conditions around her acceptance. Charles opens the folder again and turns to the sections she has not yet seen. The restriction, he explains, reaches beyond rooms and keys. Certain estate arrangements, household spending permissions, and long-term occupancy protections were tied into the same framework. Estate arrangements define how royal property is managed and used over time, while occupancy protections determine who can live in particular residences and under what authority. Removing one barrier could therefore weaken several others. Camilla looks down at the pages and finally understands the scale of what she is confronting. Elizabeth had not created one isolated refusal. She had built a system. Charles closes the file and makes his decision for the moment. He will sign nothing tonight. Instead, he orders the complete legal record brought to him for review. Camilla hears hesitation. Worse, she hears the possibility of rejection. Now the argument leaves the private room and enters the machinery of monarchy, where feelings carry weight. But documents decide what power actually exists. For years, Camilla's position beside Charles seemed to answer every question about rank. But the legal file reveals a harsher truth. Proximity to the sovereign is not the same as possessing the sovereign's powers. One signature could theoretically undo Elizabeth's decree. Yet doing so would force Charles to personally accept responsibility for breaking a safeguard designed by his predecessor. And as he reads page after page, the king begins to understand why the document was written to make reversal difficult. Charles sits alone, with the complete file spread before him, no longer looking at the argument as a husband trying to calm his wife. He is looking at it as the sovereign. That distinction matters because a consort may stand beside the monarch and share public duties, but does not automatically inherit the monarch's independent legal authority. Camilla's position gives her status, influence, and access through him. It does not give her ownership over every decision attached to crown property. Elizabeth had built the restriction around that principle, making it look less like a personal judgment and more like a rule about stewardship. Charles turns slowly through the pages until he reaches the clause authorizing revocation. The power is there. He could remove the restriction. His fountain pen lies beside the document, but he does not uncap it. The monarch feels the pressure of two loyalties pulling in opposite directions. Camilla expects her husband to protect her from what she sees as an old humiliation. Elizabeth's wording asks the king to think beyond one marriage and consider what happens if every personal exception becomes a future precedent. Charles keeps reading, and the file becomes even more troubling. A confidential appendix explains that the restrictions were also meant to stop protected residences from becoming bargaining tools during family disputes, separations, or changes in marital circumstances. An appendix is an additional section attached to a main document, usually containing details too specific for the central text. Here, it makes the intention unmistakable. Elizabeth was not thinking only about one woman. She was trying to prevent any future consort from turning access into permanent leverage. Charles leans back and finally sees the danger of a full repeal. If he removes Camilla's restriction completely, future consorts could point to his decision and demand the same treatment. What feels like one act of loyalty today could become a rule that weakens the crown for generations. Charles does not sign the reversal. Instead, another possibility begins forming. He could expand her practical access, guarantee that she may stay with him wherever duty requires, and still preserve the deeper boundary around permanent authority. The compromise looks sensible on paper. But compromise is not what Camilla asked for, and when she learns what Charles is preparing instead, the emotional fallout begins almost immediately. The decision is not announced with ceremony. It arrives through a revised household instruction. Camilla may continue accompanying Charles at royal residences and may use assigned apartments during official stays, but Elizabeth's deeper restriction will remain intact. No independent permanent claim. No automatic authority over the protected spaces. When the wording reaches her, Camilla reads it once, then again. What devastates her is not what Charles has granted. It is what he has refused. Camilla lowers the pages slowly and says nothing for several seconds. The revised instruction gives her wider practical access, but it keeps the old boundary exactly where it matters most. A household instruction is an internal written direction telling palace staff how royal arrangements should be handled in practice. In this case, the meaning is painfully clear. She may stay beside the king, use approved apartments, and move through the royal residences when duty requires, but she does not gain independent permanent control over the protected spaces. The staff are also told that the existing residence rules remain in force. Camilla reads the final paragraph again. Then she removes her glasses and asks her private secretary to leave the room. The door closes, and the silence hits harder than the argument did. She had expected resistance from Elizabeth years ago. What she had not expected was to become queen and still feel the force of that old refusal. Charles has given her access, but not the authority she demanded. To her, that feels like a husband choosing the logic of his mother's decree over the dignity of the woman beside him. Camilla feels the decision become real when preparations begin for an upcoming stay at one of the protected residences. An aide approaches with a practical question about whether several personal belongings should be transferred permanently into an apartment she has used before. The queen consort pauses. Before this dispute, she might have answered without thinking. Now every room carries a different meaning. Every arrangement feels temporary, because she knows the permission comes through Charles rather than through a right of her own. Camilla looks at the aide and speaks quietly. No, leave everything exactly where it is. The answer is simple, but the hurt beneath it is unmistakable. She will not behave as though she possesses something the written order says she does not. Charles hears about that moment soon afterward. He understands immediately what her response means. His compromise may have protected the crown's structure, but it has wounded the person he was trying to protect at the same time. Charles knows another legal explanation will only make things worse. This conversation can no longer happen through files, instructions, or advisors. He decides to see her alone. For the first time, the fight over royal property falls away completely, leaving only a husband, a wife, and the painful question neither law nor protocol can answer for them. There are no advisors in the room this time, no folders, no ceremonial language. Charles finds Camilla alone and tells her that refusing to erase Elizabeth's decree was not a declaration against her. It was a decision about the crown he now carries. Camilla listens without interrupting, until he finally admits the part he avoided saying before. If he destroys every boundary his mother created simply because it hurts someone he loves, then he turns kingship into something Elizabeth spent her life trying to prevent. Charles speaks more softly now because the legal argument is over. He explains that kingship forces him to separate personal reassurance from institutional permanence, especially when one decision could shape what future sovereigns and consorts expect. A consort is the spouse of a reigning monarch, but that position does not automatically carry the monarch's independent powers. He makes one thing clear: Camilla's daily life will not be reduced. She will continue staying beside him at royal residences wherever duty takes them. The restriction is about permanent authority, not whether she belongs at his side. Camilla finally tells him what the decree did to her. She says seeing Elizabeth's signature made her feel as though all the years of public judgment had never truly ended. The coronation had seemed like the final answer to every old doubt, yet one written order had brought those doubts rushing back. Charles listens, then tells her that belonging and unrestricted control were never meant to be the same test. Elizabeth could accept her place in the family while still drawing limits around the crown. Charles then reaches for the one detail he had withheld. He tells her about the handwritten note attached to the file, quoting from the documented account he reviewed earlier. Elizabeth had written that future monarchs should preserve the restriction only if they believed it still protected the institution. That sentence changes the room immediately. The note was not a command from the grave, it was discretion. Camilla understands the truth at once. Charles could have removed the restriction, he simply chose not to. Strangely, that realization hurts less than the idea that he had been powerless. At least now she knows the decision belongs to him, not to a dead hand still controlling their marriage. Camilla does not ask him again to reverse the decree. Instead, she asks for one assurance. If this ever becomes public, he must not allow the palace to make her look greedy, rejected, or unworthy. Charles promises he will not. That concern proves prophetic, because within hours the private dispute bursts into public view, and one image outside the palace comes to define the entire controversy. By morning, the dispute is no longer private. Broadcasters lead with the extraordinary claim that an Elizabeth-era restriction still governs Camilla's access to protected royal residences, while commentators debate whether Charles has defended tradition or humiliated his own wife. But one image cuts through every argument. A small crowd standing outside Buckingham Palace beneath rain-darkened umbrellas, watching the gates, as though the answer might somehow emerge from behind them. Camilla watches the coverage without speaking. One presenter describes the dispute as a battle between personal status and inherited royal limits, and the words land with painful precision. Palace communications move quickly to contain the damage, describing the arrangement as continuity in crown property governance. A simple way of saying that the rules controlling official royal property have not changed. The statement matters because it separates the issue from her marriage and public role. She remains beside Charles. Her title remains untouched. But the deeper restriction remains untouched too. Charles reacts differently. He grows frustrated as newspaper after newspaper reduces the decision to a single emotional choice: mother or wife. To him, that framing ignores everything he wrestled with inside the legal file. He was not trying to preserve Elizabeth's judgment merely because it was hers. He was protecting a rule he believed still served the crown. Yet public stories prefer conflict to complexity, and the king knows that once such a narrative takes hold, explanation rarely catches up with emotion. Outside Buckingham Palace, that emotion becomes impossible to ignore. Supporters and critics gather beneath umbrellas, some defending the monarch's restraint, and others calling the restriction a humiliation for Camilla. One person raises a newspaper above the crowd. Across the front page, the fictional headline reads, "Elizabeth's last line holds." The phrase spreads quickly, because it captures everything in 5 words: the old queen's authority, the present king's refusal, and the consort caught between them. Camilla sees the headline later and does not react immediately. The words would once have enraged her. Now they feel different. She knows Charles had the power to reverse the decree and chose not to, but she also knows why. That understanding does not erase the hurt. It simply gives the hurt a shape she can finally accept. The palace then releases its final statement. Residence arrangements remain unchanged. There will be no total reversal. The speculation ends. Camilla understands what that means. The argument is settled in practice. She can continue beside Charles, but she will not possess the permanent authority she demanded. And that final choice, not the legal language, not the headlines, not even Elizabeth's signature, becomes the real verdict on what this confrontation has done to the monarchy. In the end, Charles does not reverse Elizabeth's decree. Camilla does not receive the unrestricted authority she demanded. Yet the confrontation does not destroy their marriage, nor does it reduce her public role. Instead, it forces both of them to confront an uncomfortable truth at the heart of monarchy. Love can open doors, rank can transform a life, and coronations can change titles. But the crown survives by keeping some powers larger than the people who temporarily hold them. Camilla returns the copy of the decree to Charles and places it quietly on the table between them. She tells him she will not ask him to revoke it again. The final settlement is now clear. She may continue staying with him across royal residences and may use protected spaces when formally authorized, but those properties will not become her independent domain. That distinction matters because crown stewardship means managing royal property for the institution and future reigns, not treating it as private property that can be permanently claimed through marriage. Charles listens carefully because he knows acceptance does not mean the pain has disappeared. He acknowledges that the document reopened old wounds and made her feel judged by Elizabeth long after the former monarch was gone. The king promises that the restriction will never be used to diminish her personally or question her place beside him. She remains queen. She remains his wife. But the boundary around permanent authority will stay exactly where the crown now believes it belongs. Camilla finally understands the deeper meaning of the fight. For years, she had measured acceptance through access, status, and the removal of every barrier that once separated her from royal life. Now she recognizes that belonging cannot be proven by possession alone. Her place rests in the duties she performs, the role she carries beside Charles, and the life they continue to share. The rooms do not define her position. The title does not erase every limit. Charles also accepts his own consequence. Preserving Elizabeth's safeguard means accepting the loneliness that comes when a monarch must disappoint someone he loves in order to protect a principle he believes will matter beyond his own reign. He prevents one private concession from becoming a sweeping precedent for future consorts, while keeping his marriage intact. No one walks away triumphant. Elizabeth's principle survives. Camilla accepts that becoming queen never meant inheriting every privilege without limits. Charles keeps both the woman beside him and the boundary he believes protects the monarchy. There is no further battle to fight. The decree remains. Camilla accepts the boundary, and Charles keeps both his marriage and the principle he believes protects the crown, ending the confrontation not with triumph, but with a difficult peace. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.